The wind howled across the barren plains, a cruel reminder of the unforgiving world beyond the tiny trading post. Inside, the fire in the hearth sputtered, casting flickering shadows on the walls, but the heat it offered was no match for the cold gnawing at the woman's bones. Clara stood behind the counter, staring at the loaf of bread in her hand as though it were the last thing she'd ever touch. Her fingers trembled, not from the chill in the air, but from the weight of the decision she just made. A low knock sounded at the door, breaking her trance. It was slow, deliberate, as though the man outside already knew she was awake. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was, she had been waiting for him. The door creaked open, and a tall, cloaked figure stepped inside. The wind screamed behind him, kicking dust and snow into the room, but he stood there, unmoved, his figure framed in the doorway. "You're late," Clara said quietly, her voice flat, almost lifeless. The man didn't speak at first, just surveyed the small room. His eyes were hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but the presence he carried was enough to make Clara's pulse quicken. He had the look of someone who had seen far too much, someone who knew what it meant to walk away from a life, and in his case, to walk back into one, with nothing but a promise. "I've got the money," he said, his voice gruff, but there was something beneath it, something softer, like a weight he couldn't shake. Clara didn't move, still staring at the bread in her hands. The air between them was thick with the unspoken. He had come for the same thing every man came for, her soul, her future. She took a deep breath, setting the bread down on the counter. "It's not enough," she said. The man's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" "I paid the price we agreed on." She met his gaze finally, her lips tight, her heart heavy with the bitter truth. "The price you paid was never for the bread." She stepped away from the counter, her feet dragging against the wooden floor. "You know what I sold." His silence was all the answer she needed. He had been the one to buy it, after all. The stranger who had promised her something when she had nothing left to give, except herself. Clara took a step toward him, the weight of her decision bearing down on her. She had sold everything, and now, here he was, back to collect. And just as the tension thickened in the room, a voice cut through the silence from the door behind him. "You've got her all wrong." The man turned quickly, hand on his holster. Clara froze at the sound of the voice, low, steady, but full of a quiet fury. The man who stood behind the cloaked stranger was a few years younger than him, but his presence was no less commanding. His eyes were sharp, intense, and filled with something that Clara couldn't quite place, though it pulled at her, deeper than the emptiness she felt inside. The cloaked man shifted, his hand dropping from the hilt of his gun as he turned to face the new arrival. "And you are?" he asked, his voice rough with suspicion. The newcomer's eyes remained on Clara, ignoring the question completely. "I'm the one who should have been here." "Not him," he said, his words carrying an unmistakable weight. Clara swallowed hard, unsure whether to feel relief or fear. She hadn't expected him to show up, not now. Not when the decision had already been made. The stranger took a step closer to Clara, his boots scraping against the wooden floor, the tension in the room thickening. His coat brushed the floor as he stood beside her, but he didn't look at her. His focus was on the cloaked man. "You don't belong here," the stranger said coldly, his hand twitching at his side, a barely visible gesture that suggested a readiness to draw. "Not after what you've done." Clara's heart raced. The man, he was a familiar face, though not in the way she would have liked. He was the one who had once promised her a life, a future, a chance at something more than this bleak existence. But when his promises faded like smoke in the wind, she had chosen a different path. And now, here he was, the man she had tried so desperately to forget, back to confront the choices she had made. "Stay out of this," the cloaked man said, his voice harsh, eyes flashing with a threat that carried far beyond his words. "This isn't your business." Clara's chest tightened. She could feel the heavy weight of their eyes on her now, the past she had buried so deep, the promises she had thrown away, and the cruel realities she had allowed to unfold. In one corner of the room, the stranger's presence lingered like a ghost, and in the other, The man who had taken what she had to offer stood waiting for the final price to be paid. The silence between the three of them hung thick in the air. Every breath, every movement seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 decisions. Clara's throat tightened as her eyes flicked between the two men. One had bought her soul with promises of stability. The other, her heart was something more dangerous: love, loyalty, or perhaps just a chance at redemption. The stranger's eyes locked onto hers now, and in them, Clara saw something she hadn't dared to look for in so long. He wasn't here for the bread, not truly. He was here for something far more complicated: a choice. A choice between survival and something she had long since given up on. "Clara," he said, his voice soft but insistent. "Don't do this. Don't sell yourself to him. Not now." But the cloaked man was watching her now, his voice cutting through the moment like a blade. "You've made your choice, haven't you? You can't turn back now." Clara's fingers curled into fists at her sides, her thoughts colliding in a storm of emotion. She wanted to scream, to run, to disappear. But she couldn't. Not from this. She looked back at the stranger, his face a mask of quiet desperation. He had always known her too well, and now, that knowledge was both her burden and her salvation. "Clara, please," he whispered, his voice full of pain. "You don't have to be alone in this." Her mind raced, her chest tightening as the reality of her choices slammed into her. The bread, the deal that had bound her soul to the stranger, was no longer the issue. It was about who she was now, who she could still become. Her breath hitched. I don't know if I can turn back," she whispered. The stranger's eyes softened for a moment, but the tension between them remained, thick as ever. And then, as though the choice had already been made, the sound of approaching hooves cut through the moment. Far off, in the distance, the rhythm of riders drew closer. The stranger's eyes flicked to the door. "Get ready," he said grimly. Clara's stomach churned. The story was far from over. The sharp clip-clop of hooves grew louder, and with it, a sense of foreboding settled into the room like dust. The cloaked man's posture stiffened, his hand instinctively brushing the handle of his revolver. Clara's heart quickened. She had no idea who was riding toward them, but the sense of urgency in the stranger's eyes told her everything she needed to know. They weren't just visitors. They were a threat, an unstoppable force about to collide with everything she had spent years trying to forget. "Damn it!" the cloaked man muttered under his breath, stepping toward the door. "We've run out of time." Clara's pulse hammered in her throat. She wanted to scream, to run, but her feet were frozen to the floor. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about the choices they had all made, the promises, the betrayals, the quiet sins that had festered in the dark corners of the world. The storm had come, and it wasn't waiting for anyone. The stranger's hand gripped her wrist with an intensity that almost made her gasp, his fingers firm but not painful. His eyes locked onto hers, pleading with her. "Clara, don't let them take you. Not like this." His words sent a shiver through her, but it was the sudden sound of horse hooves outside that cut through her thoughts. The door slammed open, and the dim light of the dying day spilled into the room. 3 men rode in, each one casting long, menacing shadows on the wooden floor. They were rough, hardened by the life they had chosen. Their faces were unreadable, cloaked in shadows, but Clara could feel their coldness in her bones. They had come for her. She knew that much without a word being said. The man in the lead dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the wooden floor with a quiet thud that seemed too final. His eyes flicked between the stranger and the cloaked man, a cold smirk pulling at the corner of his lips. "I reckon we're late to the party," he drawled, his voice a gravelly whisper of smoke and danger. "But don't worry, we ain't here for the bread." Clara's stomach dropped. She knew that voice. It was the same man who had turned her world upside down months ago, Carl Heller. The outlaw, the devil in disguise, and the man who had promised her nothing but pain. The stranger's hand tightened around her wrist, and Clara saw the hard set of his jaw, the grim determination in his eyes. He wasn't backing down. "Carl," the cloaked man said slowly, his voice colder than the wind outside. I thought we had an agreement. Heller's eyes flicked to the man in the cloak before settling on Clara. His gaze was almost predatory, like a wolf sizing up its prey. Oh, we had an agreement, all right, Heller said with a twisted smile. But that was before you got in the way. The stranger's posture shifted, a slight twitch in his hand that told Clara he was ready for anything. The tension in the room felt like a live wire, humming with the threat of violence. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Every muscle in her body screamed for her to run, but there was nowhere to go. Heller's men dismounted and moved toward her, their eyes dark with intent. Clara's skin prickled with fear as the reality of the situation settled in. She had been so focused on the bread, so obsessed with the idea that she could trade her soul for something as simple as survival, that she hadn't seen what was coming. This wasn't just about a transaction anymore. It was about power. And Karl Heller, like the rest of them, had come to claim it. Clara, Heller said softly, as though he were speaking to a child. You belong to me now. I made sure of it. The stranger stepped forward, positioning himself between Clara and the men who now surrounded them. His eyes never left Heller. You'll have to go through me first, he said, his voice cold and calm, a sharp contrast to the tension in the room. Heller's grin widened. Don't make promises you can't keep. Before anyone could react, the sound of a gunshot split the air, echoing like thunder across the plains outside. The room seemed to freeze in that moment, the shot hanging in the silence. It wasn't aimed at anyone in particular, but it was a warning, one that came from somewhere beyond the door. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't see them, but she could feel them. The riders outside were coming, and they weren't here to talk. In an instant, everything shifted. The room seemed smaller, the walls closing in. The weight of the choices Clara had made, the paths she had crossed, all led to this moment. She was trapped between men who held her future in their hands, and each one was ready to take what they thought was theirs. The stranger's eyes met Clara's one last time, a silent promise in them. We're not done yet, he whispered. The world outside was about to crash into their fragile world of lies and broken promises. The tension in the room grew unbearable, and Clara could feel the weight of it pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Karl Heller and his men were now fully inside, their boots scraping against the wooden floor, and the stranger was still positioned protectively between her and them. His back was stiff, his eyes narrowed in determination, but Clara could sense something else beneath his hardened exterior, something that made her heart ache. The room was filled with the pungent scent of sweat, leather, and gunpowder. The wind howled outside, rattling the doorframe as though urging the confrontation to explode. But for a moment, it was just the two of them, the stranger and Clara, locked in a fragile silence that seemed to hold the world outside at bay. Clara's fingers trembled, and she couldn't tell if it was from the cold or the overwhelming sense of uncertainty gnawing at her. She had never felt so small, so lost. The bread, the deal she had made, it all felt like a lifetime ago. The life she had sold, the hope she had traded for survival, was now hanging in the balance, and she wasn't sure if she could bear the weight any longer. Clara, the stranger murmured, his voice low, filled with something soft but raw, something she hadn't heard in years. I told you I wouldn't leave you. And I meant it. His words hit her like a tidal wave, washing over the numbness she had built around herself. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of the man who had once promised her more than survival. A flicker of warmth was there, hidden beneath the cold veneer, and it was enough to make her heart beat faster. Her voice cracked as she spoke. You shouldn't be here. You. She stopped, her throat tightening with the weight of everything she had kept buried. You don't owe me anything. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a small step closer, the space between them narrowing. His eyes never left hers, and Clara could see the quiet desperation in them. For the first time since he'd entered the room, the stranger didn't look like a man willing to fight for survival. He looked like a man who was fighting for something far more dangerous, something that could shatter them both. Clara swallowed hard, her heart racing. I sold my soul for bread, I. She didn't know how to finish the sentence. The truth felt too sharp, too painful, but it had been years in the making. I thought I could survive if I just gave him what he wanted. The stranger didn't say a word. Instead, he reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before gently cupping her cheek. The warmth of his touch was like a lifeline, pulling her back from the edge she had been teetering on. It was tender, reassuring, and for a split second, Clara thought she might finally be able to breathe again. You never had to sell anything, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I would have given you everything. Her eyes welled up with tears she had not allowed herself to shed. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It wasn't about bread or deals. It was about a man who saw her, who wanted to save her from the wreckage she had become. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, he continued, his voice strained. I'm just asking for a chance to make it right. Clara's chest tightened, and for a brief, fleeting moment she felt something she hadn't in a long time, a flicker of hope. But it was immediately overshadowed by the harsh reality of the situation. The men outside, the gunfire, the inevitable storm that was approaching. Heller's voice broke through the fragile silence, pulling Clara back to the present. Enough of this. She's mine and you, he spat, are just a fool who doesn't know when to walk away. The stranger's hand slowly dropped from Clara's cheek, his eyes never leaving hers. For the briefest moment, there was something in his gaze, something that made her feel like she was being seen in a way no one else ever had. The weight of the world seemed to lift for a split second, as though the two of them existed outside of time and consequence. But that moment didn't last. The stranger straightened, his jaw tightening as he turned to face Heller and his men. I'm not leaving without her. You'll have to kill me first. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as the air in the room grew colder. She wanted to speak, to stop them before it all escalated, but her voice failed her. All she could do was watch, helpless, as the two men who had defined her past now stood at odds, the weight of their choices crashing against each other like a storm. And outside, the sound of approaching riders echoed louder, bringing with them the promise of violence. The stranger's hand hovered near his revolver, the quiet click of leather against metal the only sound in the room. Heller's eyes gleamed with a twisted satisfaction, and Clara knew the moment of reckoning was upon them. In the silence that followed, she couldn't help but wonder if it was too late to turn back. Too late to undo the choices that had led her here. And just as the door slammed open, the sound of boots thundering across the floor, Clara realized something. Her life, her soul, was no longer just her own to control. It had been taken. And now, it was up to the stranger to decide whether to save her, or to sacrifice everything for a future they could never have. The room erupted in motion. The choice was no longer hers. The door crashed open with a force that sent the walls of the small trading post trembling. The riders who had been circling outside were now upon them, their boots heavy against the floorboards as they entered. Clara's pulse pounded in her ears, drowning out everything else. The room was suddenly suffocating, the air thick with tension. But it wasn't just the men that had entered. It was the inevitable, the past, and the price they had all paid. The stranger's hand shot to his revolver with the practiced fluidity of a man who had lived through too many battles. He had no time to waste. Heller's men stepped forward, but their eyes flicked nervously to the new riders, their posture uncertain. They knew this wasn't just another skirmish, this was something bigger, something that could cost them more than they were willing to pay. Clara's heart clenched as she watched the stranger face down Heller, the standoff between them as raw and brutal as the desert sun. The stranger wasn't backing down. His jaw was clenched, his gaze fixed on the outlaw who had claimed her life. Enough, Heller said, his voice cold and filled with venom. She's mine, and that means everything she's ever had or will have belongs to me. You think you can just walk in here and take her from me? Think again. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The words sliced through her like a knife. But they weren't true. They couldn't be. She had never been his to begin with. And the stranger, the man who had risked everything for her, was about to prove it. Without a moment's hesitation, the stranger's hand went to his gun, the metallic click of the hammer pulled back loud in the room. Heller's eyes widened as the stranger's pistol was raised with precision, the barrel pointing directly at him. "Make no mistake," the stranger said, his voice low, but full of quiet fury. "She's not yours. Not now. Not ever. And if you think I'm leaving without her, you're wrong." The tension snapped. There was no more room for negotiation, no more promises. It was life or death, nothing more. The world outside seemed to disappear, as if time itself had frozen, leaving only the two men locked in a battle of wills. For a heartbeat, everything was still. Then, like a flash of lightning, everything erupted. Gunfire split the air, and Clara's heart stopped. But it wasn't the stranger's bullet that flew first. It was Heller's. The shot rang out, but it didn't hit the stranger. Instead, it found one of Heller's men, the one standing closest to Clara. The man crumpled to the floor, blood blooming across his chest like a dark stain on the floorboards. Clara's hands shot to her mouth, a strangled gasp escaping her. The world seemed to spin as chaos erupted all around her. The stranger acted instantly, drawing his gun with a speed that was almost too fast for Clara to comprehend. His bullet found its mark, Heller's hand, sending the revolver flying across the room. The outlaw let out a curse, his eyes wide with fury as he scrambled to reach for another weapon, but the stranger was already moving, closing the distance between them with purposeful strides. "You're done," the stranger growled, his voice calm, controlled. Heller's eyes narrowed, a snarl curling his lips, but there was nothing he could do now. He was outmatched, outgunned, and every move he made was a desperate attempt to claw back some semblance of control. But the stranger wasn't giving him that luxury. With a final, swift motion, the stranger knocked Heller to the ground. The outlaw's breath came in ragged gasps, but there was no fight left in him. The other men, watching in stunned silence, took a step back, the realization of their situation sinking in. They had come here to claim Clara, to take what they believed was theirs, but it was clear now that their claim was nothing more than an illusion. Clara didn't know how long she had been standing there, frozen in place, watching it all unfold. But when the last of Heller's men dropped their weapons and took a step back, she finally allowed herself to breathe again. The stranger turned to her, his expression softening. He walked toward her, slowly, as if every step were deliberate, as if he knew there was more to this than just surviving the moment. "Clara," he said quietly, almost reverently, as if he couldn't quite believe she was still standing there. "Are you all right?" Her chest heaved with the effort to breathe, but the raw terror was beginning to dissipate. The danger was still present, but the man who had been her past, her mistake, was now on the ground, defeated. And the man in front of her, the one who had stayed, the one who hadn't turned away, was offering her something she hadn't dared to believe in for years: hope. I'm fine," she whispered, but the words were weak, unsure. She wasn't sure if she was fine. She wasn't sure of anything anymore. But she knew one thing. This man, this stranger, had given her back something she had thought she lost forever. And that, more than anything else, was worth fighting for. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, and the dust had settled in the wake of the storm. The night outside was quiet, save for the occasional gust of wind that rattled the shutters. Clara looked at the stranger, the man who had given her something she could never repay: his heart, his trust, his promise. She took a tentative step toward him, then another, until she was standing in front of him, close enough to see the weariness in his eyes, the scars that told stories she wasn't ready to hear, but somehow understood. "I'm not asking for anything," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Except a chance to make this right. Whatever that looks like." Clara's hand reached out, her fingers brushing his arm, and she realized that after everything, after all the loss, all the mistakes, there was still something to be found. Something worth believing in. The two of them stood there for a long time, either speaking, but in that silence they knew. It wasn't about the bread. It wasn't about the soul she had sold. It was about a second chance, something that, for the first time, felt real. Years later, When Clara would think back to that moment, she would remember how the world had seemed to change in the blink of an eye. She would remember the stranger's hand in hers, the firelight flickering in the dark, and the quiet promise that had finally been fulfilled. And for once, she would allow herself to believe that she could be whole again. The wind howled outside, but inside, there was warmth. And that warmth, after so many years of cold, was enough. The last shot, the faint silhouette of a man and a woman standing together, framed by the glowing light from the hearth. The door creaks open, and the wind blows gently, but inside, everything is calm. The faintest glimmer of a new beginning.